Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. My name is Amelia Layton. I'm the Public Programs Manager in the Education and Community Engagement Department at the Tacoma Art Museum. I want to start by acknowledging that we learn, live, reflect, and teach on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people. As our museum is specifically situated on the traditional homeland of the Puyallup tribe of Indians, we make intentional efforts to create inclusive and respectful partnerships that honor Indigenous cultures, histories, identities, and socio-political realities. Throughout today's discussion, you're encouraged to ask questions in the Q&A and make use of our chat. I will be monitoring both, and if your question isn't answered right away, we will make sure to have time at the end to get everyone's questions answered. We are here with the Race and Pedagogy Institute because of the Kinsey collection. Dr. Gordon was a member of our community advisory panel for the exhibition and helped us connect to RPI. The Kinsey African American Art and History Collection celebrates the achievements and contributions of Black Americans from 1595 to present times. Considered one of the most comprehensive surveys of African American history and culture outside of the Smithsonian Institution, the exhibition of the same name features the shared treasures amassed by Shirley and Bernard Kinsey during their 5 decades of marriage. We hope you have all had or will have a chance to see the exhibition at TAM on view through November 28th. Now on to RPI. In their 18 years of sustained focus and collaborative work, the Race and Pedagogy Institute has staged a range of more than 20 summits and conferences, spawned an assortment of collaborations across academia and communities, provided a variety of educational resources for transformative pedagogy into the Puget Sound campus and beyond, brought together disparate communities to generate vigorous thinking about race, equity, and education, inspired a plethora of initiatives focused on the work of education and equality, both in K-12 and higher education, and has been one of the voices of change seeking to transform the landscape of education on their campus and beyond. All of this has been undertaken as a part of their mission of educating teachers and students at all levels to think critically about race and to act to eliminate racism. We're super excited to have y'all at TAM, even virtually. I'm going to hand it over to our moderator, Grace Livingston, Professor of African American Studies and a co-founder and member of Race and Pedagogy at the University of Puget Sound. Thank you, and take it away.
Thank you very much, Amelia, and thank you all for being here with us. Gratitude to all of you. We can't see you, but we know you're there in numbers. So greetings and welcome to you. As Amelia said, my name is Grace Livingston. I use she, her pronouns, and I am part of the Race and Pedagogy Leadership and Teach and Work in African American Studies. And I, along with my colleagues, Serena Sevasin, who we hope to see soon. Serena and I are both working from the campus of the University of Puget Sound, and we had a moment there with the electricity, so we weren't quite sure. So I got on, I'm in one building, and I'm holding out that she will be here too, right? So Serena Sevasin, who she's a present Puget Sound senior, will be part of this discussion and will be introduced in far more detail by my colleague, Professor Simms, and with us is Angela Weaver, Liaison Librarian for African American Studies, and so much more, who will be further introduced by our colleague, Professor Renee Simms, and the person who I consider to be our anchor, our leader, our thought processor, or curator for these series of workshops that will start today, go on September 19th through 26th, and that is Professor Dr. Renee Simms. Thank you very much, Renee, for your leadership, your thinking, and your curation. So I just want to pause, and I'm doing it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Renee. I also, in the spirit of having a collective presence, we also represent the broader leadership team and the Faculty of African American Studies with whom we have done this work in collaboration. There's a sense in which the Race and Pedagogy Institute is so foundationally attached to the African American Studies work at Puget Sound. So I just want to call the names of Professor Nancy Bristow, Professor Carolyn Weiss, Professor Jonathan Stockdale, who are members of the leadership team, along with myself, and Professor Simms, and Professor Dr. Latoya Brackett, who is also a member of the leadership team and part of the Faculty of African American Studies. I too want to join Amelia in thanking our founding director of African American Studies and the Race and Pedagogy Institute for making sure that this work happened, responding to the invitation, and even as he is now Executive Vice President at the Evergreen State College, we still remember that initial move that brought us together. So thank you for marking that, Amelia, and we too mark it. And we also mark the long partnership with TAM, with the Tacoma Art Museum, that the work in Race and Pedagogy has had. We've had a relationship that goes as early as the first Race and Pedagogy National Conference of 2006. And I also know that during the 1930s, the Jones was the home of the Tacoma Art Museum for a while. So I also want to mark that. I would also, in the spirit of the work that is Race and Pedagogy and African American Studies, want to read a statement that was developed for the Race and Pedagogy National Conference of 2018. It joins Amelia's, and it speaks to the work that we do, our understandings that are historical, ethical, pedagogical, in terms of the unfinished work of justice. And we want to read a statement of land acknowledgement that was developed and we have engaged since then since the Race and Pedagogy National Conference. This statement was prepared as we were preparing to do that conference, to stage that conference, and it was developed on the initiative of Professor Dexter Gordon in collaboration with Bina McLeod, Puyallup Tribe of Indians, Chief Lechai School's Director of Culture, Parent and Community and Student Success at Chief Lechai, and Professor Doug Stackman, Professor of History at Puget Sound, and myself. Language goes, we begin this session with a heartfelt acknowledgement of the Puyallup Nation, on whose land we stand. Despite being the targets of invasion, occupation, and displacement, leading to centuries of trauma, the Puyallup people have extended to us the courtesy of a welcome to their home. We are guests and beneficiaries of this welcome. Through this acknowledgement, we signal our participation in the necessary project of reimagining the social contracts between Native people and the rest of us who have shown up through different routes to these Native nations. Our solidarity is with Native people in their efforts to end the generations of historical trauma. Breathe in the beauty of these settings beside the Salish Sea. As guests, do take full advantage of every opportunity for learning and growth. Please do so with the awareness of the living heritage of the land on which we stand. Professor Simms, Angela, and Serena, and myself are part of the session today because we are part of the heritage of the work of Race and Pedagogy and African American Studies. Amelia spoke at length and fully, and thank you, Amelia, to the meaning of the work, the matter of the work of Race and Pedagogy, and that work is so deeply attached to to foundational principles of the field, the larger field that is African American studies, which is the concern of Shirley, Bernard, and Khalil Kinsey in this Kinsey collection. And for us in the program in African American studies, or in our minor and our major, we have five principles. I'll only mark 3 in this moment as we think about how we might engage and continue to engage the work that the Kinseys have provided for us and exhibited at TAM. We want for students to acquire sophisticated knowledge of African American and other African diasporic experiences. We want for students through that to develop critical, intellectual, and ethical perspectives that can guide and advance educational, civic, political, and also their professional actions. Very importantly, and this is just a few of the part of the principles of African American studies or orientation, all of our classes, is that we want for students to engage and interact with differential sites of community development and leadership in the Puget Sound and beyond, so as to deepen and apply their understanding of African American studies and to learn to contribute collaboratively to the ongoing work of equity and justice. We hear the resonance of those principles, the principles at the heart of the orientation, with the theme that we have developed for this first workshop: cultivation as practice, responding to Samuel L. Dunson's The Cultivators. Our core question is, how can we cultivate Black history and knowledge in our everyday lives? And out of that, some of the questions are formed, to which Professor Simms will speak. I will note three things. One, that the Kinsey family, in several interviews, mark for us that this collection, this act of living everyday pedagogy, steeped in vision, was located in community and the family. It started with the birth of their son, so located in community and the family. It started with a question their son brought home, so the educational system. It started with a response to the mini series of Roots. So it started with a question and a concern about family, about community, and about the larger social world. For us, it's so important that it's located and it's also large and expansive. 500 years. 500 years. When we think of the significance of that 500 years, if we use the voice of, and I'll close here and hand the mic to my colleague, Professor Simms. If we think about that 500-year expansiveness in the terms of Professor Christina Sharp, a scholar whom we teach in African American studies, she says that in our time, in that 500 years plus, she says that we're living in the wake. In that text, in the wake on Blackness and being, she says the wake is marked at least in 3 ways. It is that path behind those enslavement ships of devastation. The wake is also the act of keeping watch with the dead. There are elements of those 2 that are part of the Kinsey collection. It was part of my experience when I went. There's a 3rd part. In the wake also means paying attention to a coming to consciousness. A new kind of consciousness, questioning the consciousness I have, the consciousness you have, and what relearning our myths might look like. There were so many poses of just quietness and just you could feel the bodies, you could feel the responses from children and adults while I was there, coming to consciousness. That's significant to the contribution of being in the wake. So these workshops are in the wake with all those three promises ahead of us and more, and practices and principles ahead of us to think on, to take further. Again, I want to thank you for being here and welcome you. And I want to pass the mic to our lead curator and thinker for this event, Professor Renee Simms.
Thank you, Professor Livingston and Amelia, for the context about RPI, the Race and Pedagogy Institute, and African American Studies at the University of Puget Sound, and also TAM. I didn't realize TAM was in Jones, so thank you for that information. I'd like to further orient our audience. First, I'd like to let you know that Serena is on her way. And once again, I'm just so thankful that we are able to go forward because there was a power outage on our campus. And so Professor Livingston got on at the last minute and Serena has let us know she's on her way. I'd like to further orient our audience about who we are and who we are in conversation with one another. Serena Sevasin is a fourth-year student at Puget Sound with interests in art, particularly performing art, and particularly dance. She is the vice president of RDG, the all-inclusive repertory dance group at Puget Sound, which produces a performance each spring. She is a member of the Black Student Union and was part of a group of students, including Mimi Duncan, Christina Mills, and Jalen Antoine, that organized one of the biggest student-led marches in the university's history following the killing of George Floyd. It was a march that started on our campus and ended at Wright Park and involved collaboration with a variety of community partners. Angela Weaver assumed her position as the Fine and Performing Arts Librarian at the University of Puget Sound in September 2019. Prior to that, she was head of the art and drama libraries at the University of Washington in Seattle. She has an MLS from Rutgers University, an MFA in playwriting from the University of California, San Diego, and a BA in psychology from Duke University. Angela's interests include digital humanities, equity, inclusion, and diversity in libraries, and enhancing creativity through research. Her subject specialties at Puget Sound are African American studies, art and art history, Asian studies, communication studies, classics, music, and theater arts. Professor Grace Livingston's research and writing focuses on social justice education, including its impact on educational theory and practice. Trained across a broad range of disciplines, education, comparative literature, history, sociology, and theology, she is particularly interested in how knowledge is produced. In courses such as Introduction to African American Studies, Narratives of Race, and Imaging Blackness, Black Film and Black Identity, Livingston and her students address questions about how we shape and remember the past, how we engage raw truths of the present, and how we use critical examination of the past and present to forge a better future. She works with teaching and learning partners in the community and in the theater, and is a leader in the Campus Race and Pedagogy Institute. Her book chapters include Foundations of Critical Categories of Justice and Education and Handbook of Research in the Social Foundations of Education, and Dilemmas of Race Rememory, Buried Alive, Popular Education, Nation, and Diaspora in Critical Education, which is in the Routledge International Handbook of the Sociology of Education. She has served as a dramaturg for productions in the Department of Theater Arts, and her current research project is focused on the writer and anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston, who appears in the Kinsey collection. My background is in creative writing and law, and I teach courses in fiction writing, the Harlem Renaissance, survey of African-American literature, Black fictions and feminisms, and with my colleague, Rachel DeMotz, a new course on environmental racism. My research, writing, and teaching are concerned with contemporary issues of Black womanhood, community writing pedagogy, art as public pedagogy, and Black feminist interventions in law, literary canon formation, and environmental justice. I share that background so that you know we are a panel. Hi, Serena, yay, you made it. I share that background so that you know we are a panel invested and interested in the intersections of art, history, education, and community. This is also the interest of the Kinsey family, whose exhibition we're so fortunate to have at TAM through November 28th. The exhibition, as Professor Livingston said, started as private collecting by Shirley and Bernard Kinsey, then took on urgency and focus when their son Khalil was born in 1977. They've said that after their son was born and after the airing of Roots, they became increasingly interested in recovering their genealogical history as a family and as members of the African diaspora. The painting that we chose as inspiration for today's conversation, and we can put it up so that members in the audience can see, is one of the first pieces you see in the gallery space that's to the right when you come up the stairs to the 3rd floor at TAM. The collection is in 2 rooms that are to either side of that hallway, and this painting is the first you encounter in the gallery to the right. Our photo doesn't capture the work's brilliant colors, its glossiness, texture, and its 3D quality as an oil painting with paint that rises off the canvas in peaks. It is a painting of the Kinsey family by Samuel L. Dunson Jr., who is an associate professor of art at his HBCU alma mater, Tennessee State University. Dunson received his MFA in art from Savannah College of Art and Design. His painting depicts the family as harvesting books from the earth in a rural setting. There are cubist elements seen in the depiction of Bernard's face. The time period seems like the early 20th century based on how they're dressed, but time and place are not straightforward. And the attire is a mixture of formal and casual, which is not what one typically wears to harvest crops in a field. Bernard is depicted as collecting the books while Shirley is dusting them off, and Khalil is behind following his parents and reading a book by the poet Khalil Gibran. One of the ideas depicted in the painting is the idea of cultivating knowledge. When Serena chose this painting as one that we would respond to, one of the questions she suggested was, how do we cultivate knowledge about Black history? With that, I'd like to turn it over to Serena Sevasin to present her response to this question, followed by Angela Weaver.
Hello and good afternoon. My name is Serena Sevasin. I'm sure I got a wonderful introduction while I was out, but again, I use she, her pronouns. I'm a senior at the University of Puget Sound this year, studying African American studies and minoring in education. I'm very thankful that I've had the opportunity to come talk a little bit about the cultivators with you all today. I was very happy to have the opportunity to look over this collection over the summer with Race and Pedagogy as a summer programs assistant, and I'm glad I get to talk about it with you all now. So for me, cultivation as a student in school, it feels very holistic, especially when I'm studying in a field that requires you to always do a sort of cultivation. Black studies just kind of naturally does that. This for me comes in a handful of ways, and I've tried to specify them in 3 sort of core aspects and wanted to try to delve into how these relate to my general experience as a student in higher academia, as an activist that navigates issues of race and social justice, both before and through this COVID-19 pandemic, and as a person that's just generally invested in a range of clubs and organizations and places where I directly tackle sort of ongoing issues that are happening in those respective spaces. So the first thing I thought about when I approached the Cultivators as a painting was the classroom. And I think this says a lot about me inherently in the ways I initially value cultivation, which is in very academic and scholarly context, which I think is fair to note, and how cultivation reminds me immediately of knowledge, textbook knowledge to be specific. This was very general, but as I took time to really process what it meant to sort of create and collect and value and analyze knowledge, I had so many initial feelings about the artwork. So I knew it was worth investing a much greater conversation. I'm very happy to be having that with you all today. That's going to allow me to unpack that a little bit alongside some of my identities and connections to cultivation. So I'm going to go ahead and share just a brief presentation about some definitions I have for cultivating. Okay, so let me go ahead and present this. All right. So, of course, briefly, I just kind of want to touch on some keywords I threw out there while I was talking about what I use to define cultivation. So, of course, I think of cultivation as something that's very holistic. I see it in context of academia and very scholarly knowledge, but I also understand that with that, it comes with a sort of social knowledge that I don't practice as much, but with what I do through activism and work with social justice and identity as its core. So one of the words I use to sort of talk about cultivation is it being active. It's a sort of ongoing process, and I find that it requires consistency. I think in order to cultivate, it's something we all kind of naturally do. We go into classrooms every day and interact with other students as educators, or I talk with other peers and have conversations about the things we've learned in classrooms. And then I go to organizations and clubs with them later that evening. You know, you are always in this process of cultivating knowledge from others. And what I find to be the more active aspect of this is when you apply those things and you start to create these sort of legacies and histories that people can look back on through that sense of cultivation that you've done with others, which kind of leads me into my next definition, which is it being very collective. And to define that, that's not in a super physical sense. Initially, I think of collective as more of this knowledge-based thing. I think it's something that you gain. It's not just textbook knowledge, it's that social knowledge you get as well. I think it's you taking identities that you bring into spaces and using them to create more knowledge. And I think in order for it to really be collective, it cultivates work and brings liberation not only to yourself, but others as well. It allows them to have their voices included within a context. I think it also kind of just takes away a sense of erasure as well that's placed in knowledge. When you say something, there's something that isn't there as well. And I also think in a more physical sense, it takes a village. I think knowledge is something that requires more than one of anything. And I think that cultivation does kind of require more than one person in order to create something that's long lasting and sustains and goes through. And then my last sort of word is collaborative. It relates a lot to being active in this sort of collective definition that I'm giving, but it also allows you to take those perspectives that you're gaining and using them to shape the way that you inform and teach others. So of course, like we're learning all these things, but you're also providing space to provide critiques with them and perhaps see where you don't see something in your own knowledge. It fills gaps. And I think that is something that's very important to cultivation. I think collaborative for me is probably the most important aspect of cultivation because it allows you to not only have knowledge, but gain more of it. So just to kind of round this off, I wanted to just briefly share an actual video of myself. I'll go ahead and stop sharing for a moment, where I'm speaking on June 7th of 2020. It's my opening speech from the protest. I titled it After. It never really had a formal title for it, but it's me just kind of talking about these ideas that I'm realizing now relate so directly to the painting of the Cultivators. I'm talking about, of course, the context of everything that had happened just post George Floyd's death. Of course, the Black Lives Matter movement as it was gaining momentum, especially in those first couple weeks afterwards. And then really taking that idea of cultivation and moving forward by sort of pushing others to think about what do you do after today. So I'm gonna go ahead and share that with all of you in just a second. Say in this moment as well.
I'll yell. I think I'll start with saying I'm tired.
Tired.
I'm really, really tired.
Me too, girl.
I didn't know what to write ahead of today, even though I was constantly thinking about the words to say. I first want to make sure that I gave credit where it was due. I think it starts with acknowledging the emotional and physical support that Jalen and Mimi have been able to provide myself this week. But knowing that we always had each other no matter how overwhelmed, exhausted, or absolutely defeated we may have felt. I also want to acknowledge those who didn't just make their presence physically known today, but have provided their resources, time, their listening ears and shoulders to cry on for their Black friends and Black peers. We felt your effect, but it can also be seen all around you right now. This was not just efforts of us organizers, but efforts of a community. Taking me to my first thought. Community has been a critical pillar in my life, meaning I have been self-resourceful and I've gotten things done myself, but I can't deny just how much the community has gotten me to the place I am today. The movement cannot survive unless we're a community, sharing resources, educating ourselves, and being in spaces that challenge our collective mindsets and force us to be uncomfortable. Change and reform does not come to those who sit idly by. This moment, this protest, is cultivated from over 400 years of resistance and disruption. But this is it. This is that moment. This movement is short of temporary, but it is happening, and it is happening quickly. This moment where we stand right now is just a pin in a timeline of history and the resilience of Black people in our struggle. We are taking steps forward. We are saying their names. We're taking our breaths. But what are we going to do after? After today? I think the one thing that's clung to my thoughts most is, what do I do after today? What do us as organizers do after today? What does the university do? What do my friends and fellow community members do after today? What are you going to do? One of the common phrases that I've been getting from lots of my friends, more specifically white ones, is, what should I do now? Once they've attended protests, signed petitions, donated to Black organizations, even ordered takeout from a local Black restaurant, they still come to me and ask, what should I do now? And to be honest, I really hate that question. This sort of work is something that is never done, but most of all, something that applies to all mediums of life. Black lives are not a trend. My livelihood is not seasonal. Period! Black lives are not something you can reduce to hashtags or last words. Our lives are not something you can prioritize some of the time.
That's right.
Black voices cannot be silent because even when we're screaming, we are muffled. We're still muffled. We have to walk because you couldn't see us before, but we're making for damn sure you can see us right now. We continue this work because it is never finished, and we have to continue to what lies after. After today, I'm going to rest. I'm going to get right back up again tomorrow, though, and do my work all over again.
That's right.
We cannot stop after today. Today is just one step in many towards the livelihoods for my children, their children, and if the earth isn't melted by then, theirs too. We have much more than ourselves at stake. We must think of after as something much more progressive. We have to take our thoughts of after and not apply them to the moment or tomorrow or to next week. but walk forward with our prolonged futures in mind. This country will not be able to handle a wave stronger than the one hitting them now, but if we need to make it happen, so be it. We must take our thoughts and actions and make them more intentional, knowing that what we do today affects tomorrow in tenfold. So as you walk today, tomorrow, and next week, think about how you're working for this after. What does it look like? What does it feel like? But most of all, what is different? What are you going to do after? Thank you.
And that is what I consider to be cultivation. Thank you.
Thank you, Serena. Angela? And to our audience members, please feel free to drop questions or comments in the chat.
I'm going to share my screen. And I have a brief presentation as well entitled Enriching the Soil, Cultivating African American History, Culture, and Knowledge in Collins Memorial Library. In the section of The Prophet on Work, Lebanese poet Khalil Gibran writes, "And I say that life is indeed darkness, save when there is urge. And all urge is blind, save when there is knowledge. And all knowledge is vain, save when there is work. And all work is empty, save when there is love." These words are extremely relevant and revelatory when examined in conjunction with Samuel Dunson's Jr.'s portrait, The Cultivator. The painting and the sharing of the Kinsey family collection with the world serves to illustrate the fulfillment of the family's motto, "To whom much is given, much is required." Institutions of higher learning are given much and much is required of them. Gibran's section on work might serve as a blueprint for the mission of higher education, the same as it might be for the endeavors of the Kinsey family. Life is darkness except where there is urge, desire, drive, impulse. But is all impulse useful? Gibran says the urge is blind unless there is knowledge. Knowledge fuels the impulse, but knowledge alone is in vain except when there is work, the employment of knowledge and the service of. Yet work is empty save when there is love or passion. This is the heart of cultivating, of growing, raising, improving, bettering, learning, and enlightening. This is the heart of the institution. This afternoon, I will speak about academic libraries as they aid in the cultivation of Black history, culture, and knowledge. Specifically, I will introduce materials found in Collins Memorial Library's archives and special collections. For Bernard Kinsey, the Kinsey family collection is a way to tell a story that will inspire people about their possibilities. I see the archival and special materials that we collect performing a similar function. In reflection about a project her AFM 201 students participated in to create timelines of African American studies, Dr. Latoya Brackett writes, "One of the most important aspects to being the leader in one story is to ensure that the story is archived and accurately so." Our university archivist, Adriana Flores, works with student groups to collect, archive, and preserve their stories via mechanisms other than the student newspaper and yearbook. I think I'm not going forward. Let me pause it and then resume. Okay. There we go. Materials like CICE, Center for Intercultural and Civic Engagement Magazine, Black Ice, and Documenting Activism Project are opportunities for students to take agency in the creation of stories about them in ways that might not be available to them via other official mediums. Additionally, Adriana encourages current students and alumni to deposit their organizational records, photographs, flyers, and other ephemera that help to tell the story of their time here at the university. Digging in these records, these artifacts, in turn, may inspire future students about their possibilities, helping to cultivate new stories. As well as the materials related to the university, The archives has items that speak to the broader African-American experience. For example, the library has a collection of African-American Communist Party pamphlets from 1928 to 1974, and a report of the 11th Annual Convention of the National Negro Business League, which was founded by Booker T. Washington in 1900. The archives also has a zine collection, which boasts such titles as Black Women in Self-Defense, Thoughts on Personal Space and Reclaiming Our Streets, Back to Nappy, Guide to Beautifully Regressing to Natural Hair, and Brown People for Black Power on Confronting Anti-Blackness in Our Communities, among others. The library also collects zines created by individual students, collaborative projects from classes, and student organizations at the university. Zines have historically been a way for marginalized groups to have their voices heard because they cost less to produce and distribute. Finally, the last group of materials I'd like to talk about are the library's collection of artist books. Director Jane Carlin has worked tirelessly to acquire a number of artist books since her arrival at the University of Puget Sound, many of which have social justice themes. She's arranged exhibits of the materials and taught classes where students explore the artist books collections and in some cases create their own. The 4 titles I've selected are works by African-American women that speak to the Black experience in America, past and present. Wrongful Termination by Alyssa Banks is an altered law book hollowed out to contain 4 paper scrolls affixed by hair rollers over a base of synthetic hair. A 4-page accordion fold insert is affixed to the front end page. It includes 2 original poems and text from newspaper editorials. Wrongful Termination was conceived of as a companion piece to another of Alyssa's works called Bad Hair. Wrongful termination addresses race-based discriminatory practices. Starting in the 1980s, multiple suits have been filed against employers, schools, and other agencies by people of color, primarily women, who were fired, passed over for promotion or hiring, or sent home for wearing their natural hair. The next book, George and Biddy's Quarters by Carletta Carrington Wilson, consists of 3 accordion folded pages, which have the shape of a house. Each page represents a different doorway in a slave cabin, resulting in six doors outlined in haint blue. George and Biddy's Quarters is one of 7 houses that comprise part of the series, Not K-N-O-T My Name, Haint My House. While marriage was not sanctioned between enslaved persons, some people formed unions, recognizing that at any moment, their partner could be sold away without notice. Clarissa Sly's Reading Dick and Jane with Me is an artist book created to interrupt the authority of old elementary school textbooks called the Dick and Jane Readers, which they still had when I was a kid. These reading textbooks of the 1940s and 50s presented a white, upper middle class suburban family as normal for most Americans. Although statistically, the average American at this time was working class, the artist as a young girl thought these depictions meant that her family must be an aberration outside the norm. In Reading Dick and Jane with Me, children from Clarissa's old neighborhood stand in for the young people who could never talk back at that time. Sure. Lastly, we have Morning Warning by Tia Blassingham, stripping the maritime alphabet of its primary colors, except blue, and replacing them with muted browns and blacks. Morning Warning highlights the relationship of Americans of the African diaspora to water and maritime trade, as well as the need for an alternate means of communication in time of emergency and duress. How do you send a warning call that hatred comes constantly in waves? Morning Warning serves as a method of memorializing the slain and wronged, and of teaching our children and ourselves to be vigilant and wary in hostile terrain, where your skin color makes you an easy target. Each flag represents an African-American man, woman, or child who has experienced violence, is missing, or died from violence or police brutality, including Trayvon Martin, Marissa Alexander, Eric Garner, Oscar Grant, Phoenix Caldone, and Mario Woods. For too many, justice remains distant. Although our collections live at the University of Puget Sound, they are open to the wider community as an acknowledgement that we are stewards of a communal body of knowledge, art, and culture. The broader African-American communities whose histories have informed the creation of these documents, artworks, and artifacts have a right to engage with the materials and be inspired to see their possibilities and to become leaders in their own stories. Hopefully, these few examples give you a sense of what we do as a library to not only cultivate existing African-American history, culture, and knowledge through our collecting, but also how our materials and practice enrich the soil that nourish future knowledge productions. Thank you.
Thank you,
You're welcome.
Angela.
I'm going to try and stop sharing.
Thank you, Angela and Serena, for those reflections on the artist books that we have in Collins, the archival documents that we have about activism and work and curriculum from our campus, and thinking about how libraries aid in Black knowledge. And thank you, Serena, for thoughts about activism and student activism and how the cultivation of that helps to aid in Black knowledge and helps us think about not just learning things, but also putting things into action. The question that I was struck with is, what are you going to do? So thank you. Thank you for those words. We're now going to turn to some questions, a conversation between the four of us, and then open it up to questions from participants. And I'd like to start with a question to Professor Livingston. Listening to Serena, listening to Angela, this makes me think of conversations that we've had about curation and where things are placed within an exhibition, about how canons are formed, or who we choose to cite, or how we choose the texts and documents we teach inside a classroom. If we're not careful, there's always the potential that we're shaping knowledge in a way that silences certain narratives and excludes important historical figures. Which leads me to the theme of this exhibition, the myth of absence. Leading into the exhibition gallery is a quote from Lerone Bennett Jr. And I'm going to see if I can plop it into the chat, part of it. I'll have to go back and copy it again. It says in part, this is not the whole quote, but he says, in American history, as in American life, Black Americans are invisible presences. They are not seen, not because of their absence, but because of the presence of a myth that prepares and requires their absence. So my question to you, Prof. Livingston, is how do you responsibly cultivate knowledge of Black history in a way that does the least amount of harm?
Thank you, Prof. Renee, and I want to add my thanks to Angela Weaver and to Serena Sevasin. Thank you both. I think of two words, first of all. I think of part of what is going to keep taking is a disposition, so cultivating a disposition of that combines risk and courage. Because I think that silences are such stubborn things, and sometimes silences are arrogant, and the silences are resilient. Silences are supported by corporate money. They're supported by book industries, right? So there's a fortification around that. So I think it's going to require that. And if I start with the life of Zora Neale Hurston, which interests me, which you raised earlier, that so I think then that we can lean on some people who have come before. So I'm always taken that it took Alice Walker, it took us on to the late 60s and the early 70s, that we had after her death, right, over a decade after Zora Neale Hurston's passing, for Alice Walker, defying the comments that she was hearing, why are you going to do that? She went in search of Zora Neale Hurston's grave and went in search of places to publish what she had found. And it was Ms. Magazine, 1975. So I'm just thinking of sometimes where our choices come when we have to take the risk and what opens, what doors open to get the word out. And that she was writing in search of Zora Neale Hurston. And that's how we got that live. And that's how Zora Neale Hurston became intersected with the building of, in the 1970s, what then became Black Women's Studies. Right after the formation, it was not until the end of the 1970s. So I think of, we wouldn't be reading Their Eyes Were Watching God, or Muse and Men, or more, if Alice Walker hadn't pushed past and gone to that community, took the no's that happened. So I often think of, what the Kinseys did, what did they, how many no's did they meet? How many places they had to push and ask another question in order to get past. And I think that risk and that courage as a disposition is inspirational, because we have writers of this generation, scholars of this generation of African-American studies, for example, Imani Perry, who as a scholar of African-American studies and an interdisciplinary scholar of additional fields, she gave us Looking for Lorraine. So it's this looking for, searching for some idea that you've got to keep asking the question. And in the process, that looking for methodology, that press, that willingness to push past the received stories opens us up onto stories and lives of other people. So what is meaningful for me is that it's a collective project. I heard that from Serena, and I heard the power structures we have to push past from Angela. And that's what we get. So we got bigger stories of more people, and we got to ask more questions because of Walker's work and because of Imani Perry's work. And I think about how both those, the work of Walker and Imani Perry, have influenced me and influenced, giving me a sense of that risk-taking and also the kind of knowledge that has become part of my life that I would not have known about. So I'll move from that example and say, so risk and courage are dispositions that we need badly, and we need to shape it as a methodology. But perhaps I want to close my response, Prof, with this idea by using a film I saw fairly recently, and that's the USA versus Billie Holiday. And I think about that film, 2021, played by Andra Day. And as I was watching it, and I want to see it again, as I was watching it, I remembered Lady Sings the Blues, which was another rendition. That's 1972, right? In the same moment that Black Women's Studies was in the fight to be built, to ask the questions that were not being asked earlier of African-American studies, the earlier questions that are intersectional around gender and sexuality. It's important to me and significant that it's in that period we got Lady Sings the Blues, and we get this in 2021, and such a different portraiture of Billie Holiday. We get a politicization that we don't get in the earlier in the earlier period. So we get a complexity around questions of gender and violence, its structural nature. There's a way in which the personal and the political are brought together in a way that's different from the 1972 film. And in my imagination, I would love to see a conversation between Diana Ross, who played the role in 1972, and Andra Day. And that's what we want to do in community. I heard the word criticism from Serena and Angela. What would it mean to have a conversation about what happened in the dramaturgy of that work? What is it we have to learn about what we missed? Why were particular matters silenced? Why were some matters manipulated? Why were they submerged? And what would happen if that happened, and if we talked to each other and took the risk that a historian I read quite a bit on social theory, Africana social thought theorist, who tells us that there's an important connection between memory community, across memory community and criticism. And sometimes when we are careless with memory, which is what the Kinsey collection asks us, begs us not to be careless with memory. Sometimes when we're careless with memory, or we're not willing to exercise the humility to ask again, we become impatient with criticism. But it's going to take that and far more to push past, it seems to me. Thanks, Prof. I want to ask you one. Professor Simms, I'm going to ask you one. Okay. So, Prof, I am drawn to think of a facet of your work as we have this discussion, your work as a writer, that always continues to impress me. It never fails to move me and inspire me. And this facet of your work connects so deeply with Samuel Dunson's call through his painting to cultivate. I'm referencing here your unwavering investment in attending to the building of spaces and institutions that nurture, that take care of, sustain, and empower Black writers and Black voices in the development of their stories, our stories. We've had conversations in which we talk about the vital connection between building Black knowledge, Black knowledges and histories, and the crafting of spaces, public institutional spaces, where ranging and intergenerational Black people and communities can come together. That can find one another, can share in this space of public, collective, critical practice of learning together, learning from one another, and critically excavating together. What do you think it will take for us to make the cultivation and realization of this kind of work a priority and an imperative?
Oh, that's easy. No, that's a great question. And I wrote down when you repeated the words of Serena and Angela about the collective and pushing past structures. I think it takes that. And the other thing I think that is needed is organizing. So one of the things that I say to students when we're studying the Harlem Renaissance, and also when we're studying the Black Arts Movement, which comes later, is that these are not, movements that just spontaneously occurred. The Harlem Renaissance was organized, it was orchestrated, it was well thought out and planned. You had, giant intellectual thinkers like Du Bois and Alain Locke and Jesse Redmond Fawcett coming together and thinking about how to mentor, writers and artists, how to put together publications that would get the work out, how to have a collective idea, sort of branding, if you want to use that word, about what this movement was about. And also thinking about people from outside of the Black community who could be supporters and allies with what, the goals that they wanted. So that organizing seems important to me when we think about how to cultivate this knowledge and get it out. And I think about, the Harlem Renaissance. I think about the Black arts movement and how people came together and thought intentionally about Black art and how it communicated ideas about Black humanity. Because when we think of the literary world, for example, there are so many parts to getting a story. A story doesn't just become, a work doesn't become part of the canon overnight. It's vetted through all the different parts of the structures, right? So you have prizes and fellowships and residencies and editing at prestigious journals and graduate school programs and lecture series, bookshops. In the late 90s and the early 2000s, you see another type of movement happening similar to the Black arts movement and the Harlem Renaissance with the formation of Cave Canem, which became an organization that bills itself as a home for Black poetry. And then with other organizations like the Voices of Our Nations Arts Foundation, which is multicultural, but was also a place where many Black writers went, and then Conbilio Fiction. So you have organizing that happens in the 21st century and the end of the 20th century, where people are thinking intentionally about how do we get Black writers, how do we nurture each other, teach each other, and then get on the National Book Critics Circle, right? And these other places become the people who are publishing each other. So I think it takes that type of organization in addition to the collectivity, the collaboration, and pushing past the structures. And maybe it's the organizing that helps us do both of those things. And then I think amplification of voices on social media has really helped with the cultivation of Black knowledge. I think that there are ways that Black art has come to the attention of a lot of people who it wouldn't have reached, because what social media does is it takes down it eliminates the gatekeeper, right? So that discussions are being had and work is getting out to people who it wouldn't have reached before. But I think, and this is my last, I think, response to you, Prof, is in addition to organizing and thinking of ways to get the work out, I think that I have to come back to the classroom. When someone says cultivation to me, it makes me think of education in the classroom. And I think that's a responsibility that I feel, it's a heavy responsibility for me to teach students about work that they might not come across, and not just teach it, but have them understand where it comes from and how to read it, right? I told students in 205 the other day that in addition to, studying the theories, the literary movements, the things in our textbooks, you have to understand something about the culture, because art doesn't just, the critics come and tell us how to think about it after it's been created, but it comes from a place. And you have to understand the place and the people in order to understand how to read the literature. So education, I think, is a part of how we cultivate knowledge. Thank you for that question. And do you want to throw questions to Angela and Serena?
I can, well, I have one. One comes to mind for Serena. It was something you emphasized, Prof. Simms, when you were remarking on both their contributions, both Serena and Angela's contributions. the question of what we're going to do, and the question of after. That word after has been sitting with me. So what we're going to do and after is sitting right there. And so I guess maybe the do and after are for both persons, but the do is on my mind when I think about Serena. And you make me think about the way you placed academia. You know, I'm asking why and how, why for you, and how is the relationship between academia and matters of social justice? Why is that so crucial and urgent in relationship to the cultivation of Black history and Black knowledge? You seem to place quite a bit on of critique, you know, there. So why there?
Yeah, I'm more than happy to touch on that. Yeah, I think for me, it's honestly my investment in Black studies. I mean, as I'm sitting here with two of my professors in African American studies, I think you can attest to this idea that, you know, you're definitely learning in Black studies things that aren't mentioned in a lot of other classes and a lot of other disciplines that tend to lean towards more Eurocentric or, you know, just normative sort of white rhetoric. And I think that it's really easy for me to at least see that, because I've been exposed to these ideas of Black history that tell you your knowledge is not shared in white spaces. And while that's an unfortunate fact, it's something that I think I walk forward with when I pursue academia. And I think especially for me, coming from such a white sort of campus and a very white and Eurocentric curriculum in most other spaces, I think it's really easy for me to want to incorporate aspects of social justice because I just see what isn't there rather than being cognizant of what is. And I think that's something that I think is not like awesome about like being in Black studies, but I think it's really interesting that it provides you with a set of lenses that makes you see more of what isn't present rather than what is. And I think for me, social justice is just that element that isn't quite there. And I think especially now over this past year, that's been something that's been incorporated more into studies and more into classes. And I think it's in a way something that can come across as very performative. It feels as if it's done especially to serve rather than to do the general educating that students are going to school for, right? And it feels like more of a gesture than an actual notion, I think. And I think that's kind of where I stand in terms of that intersection. I think I have a lot of critique to provide towards academia just because I feel like that's an aspect that isn't touched on as much or just feels as if it isn't there, or it's something that students tend to have the burden of producing for an educator at times. And I think that's something that I have seen, experienced, and felt in other classrooms. I know it's things my peers understand. So I feel like for me, outside of Black studies, where I find most of that critique is having your educators place that work more on you and that work of social justice on you. And I think that's what wears on me as a student at times. So if that touches the question in the way you're looking for.
Yes, thank you, Serena. Thank you. Prof, can I ask Angela one? Yeah, okay. It's so I'm gonna go with the word after that's in my head, Angela, and I'm thinking about the way that your presentation made curriculum structures so very visceral, and we could sense the consequences of what happens when we don't do the critical work we're supposed to do. And if there's going to be an after, right? If there's going to be work that can be sustained, critical work that we have to revisit, if the organizing is to be intentional, then I'm thinking, then what are you thinking might be the kinds of partnerships that libraries need to be developing and deepening in order to enact with some kind of integrity the cultivation of Black history and knowledge?
Well, I think part of it is that we have to work with the communities that are doing the work. For example, Adriana is very intentional about working with student groups because they're the people who are out there doing the work. The students are creating the work, they're protesting, they're, they're producing new knowledge. And so it's upon us to work with them so that we're not trying to represent what we think they mean, that we give them agency within the archives to create meanings for themselves, that we work with them to preserve their words and to provide the context that they want to provide to those materials, that we're not putting meaning onto those materials that come from us necessarily, that it's from the community that's producing the work. I think it's important that we have community members work with us. I know that they think of public libraries or historical societies as being the places where local history is preserved, but it can also be preserved at university libraries. And I think that we should work with community members to have them understand what's important about what they're producing, that their memories, their histories are what's driving scholarship in the future. And if we're not preserving that history today, it won't be there tomorrow. There will be no after, or it'll be harder to try and go back and do what, Alice Walker did with Zora Neale Hurston. If the materials aren't there, then it's as if you never existed. And so we have to do a better job of impressing that upon communities, that it's not just the important people, but it's the everyday people, it's the everyday citizen, it's the everyday church or social organization. That's the kind of materials that give you insight into a time period, to a culture. And so if we don't have those sort of contextual materials, when we look at artwork from a particular time period, as Renee says, it's hard to understand that if you don't understand the culture that it came from. And if we don't have those cultural materials in our archives and special collections, it becomes that much more difficult to decipher what was happening in that culture. So I think we have the technical skills, we have the organizational skills, but the community has the contextual information that we need to make those materials available in the best way possible.
One of the nice touches about the oops, sorry.
No, go, Prof. Go.
I was just gonna comment, as Angela was speaking, I was thinking about the exhibition, and in that hallway that separates the two rooms, there are pictures of leaders from the Tacoma community. Dolores Silas is on there, Lyle Qasim, the mayor, and then there's a video that's playing about the Black Collective, I think. And I thought that was a nice touch to have the local there in between the Kinsey's art and artifacts on either side. Do we want to keep talking or let other people jump in?
We're running out of time a little bit, so we have about 10 minutes. There's some great questions in the chat that we've kind of touched on, but I want to make sure y'all have time to respond to. So we'll start with one for Serena. Some courses, this was speaking to your work in school, so some courses won't live up to providing the kind of cultivation that you really want. What does this feel like to you, and how do you manage yourself in that situation? You touched on it a little bit, but if you could expound a little bit.
Yeah, I think for me, I think for me, it's kind of touching on my idea of cultivation itself, right? Every class feels like a sort of stepping stone towards something. And I think there's always something to be gained from every classroom, some sort of knowledge. I would never say there's such a thing as like good, bad, right, or wrong knowledge, but I think there's definitely knowledge that's worth contextualizing and building upon. And I think that even if some courses don't provide that for you, that's where others can, right? And I think that even with as a student, this sense of like dissatisfaction at times with what I'm learning because I know there's more there. That's what provides me an opportunity to like do that myself or partake in spaces in courses that allow me to expand on that sort of mindset and thought. And while I don't per se love having the sort of labor that comes along with knowing that I have to apply myself in those spaces, I think the feeling and the knowing of that makes me a little more comfortable with the idea, right? Because I think going through that, but sitting in a state of denial and accepting what you're hearing as truth, I think is almost worse. And so for me, you know, I would say, yes, it comes with dissatisfaction, but knowing that there's always going to be more knowledge and knowing that I have the capacity to find it, I think that's what keeps me from like going under. So yeah, that's how I'll answer that one. Thank you for the question.
One of our other questions is for anyone. What are your thoughts, opinions on using art as community healing measures or public health measure, especially given the highlighted disparities from the pandemic?
I'll make a go at engaging that. I think my response to that would be in the affirmative and in this that it would be in the strong affirmative. I think that word healing, and someone put healing and public together. So healing and public and the public health pandemic. Part of what the work of Black arts, the Black art is. And I'm thinking here, when I think with the language too, that we have framed in the work of race and pedagogy as the arts as public pedagogy, that healing is at once a communal act, it's an inside act, but it's outside. And it's also an act of confrontation, right? So, but it's also confronting the questions. So the questions about health and the questions about the structures of the society that make us unwell, okay? So it doesn't make, the possibility of Black art is that it's always speaking to the inside and the outside. It does not let the systemic off the hook. And it pays attention to the insides of our lives, the psychic parts of our lives that I think when I think of those 500 years that have involved the 500 years of being in the wake of dehumanization, part of what you have dehumanization under white supremacy does is to rob you of that humanity, right? Which we have spoken here, and to rob and to seek to rob you of that humanity. So healing is an act of confrontation in community. It's with the self. It's an act of reclamation, right? And it's an act of reckoning. And you see that in the Kinsey collection, the experience of that. There were times. There are some benches in different parts of the hallway, and I think about where they're placed. And they seem to be placed maybe at some knowing areas, because there were times that I just took a seat and just said, okay, let me catch my breath right here. And I realized I was not by myself. What would happen if something else happens with a practice like that? So when I think of public healing practices and the role that that Black art has played in that, the Black arts movement that Prof. Simms referenced, we have examples there, several examples there, and there are moments there for me, and I'm sure for many of us in the Kinsey collection. So who are the institutions who are going to do that? Do educational institutions think they have a responsibility to that? Does higher ed feel it has a responsibility to make those spaces available? not only for its students, but for broader communities amidst the pandemic that has us still in masks, right? And still at a distance, but what would it mean to plan for that, and to plan for that in short moments that recognize rather than turn away from the harshness of what faces us.
And I would just
answer the question.
I don't even like to step in after Prof. Livingston speaks because she said it all. And that was a brilliant response. I'll just add what came to mind as you were speaking, Prof. Livingston, was Kohegi Dora by Gail Jones, which, you know, is a novel that looks at intergenerational trauma and tries to explore it, right? What it means to have several women within one family be sexually assaulted in an institution of slavery, and how that's inherited, how that trauma is inherited. And then Toni Cade Bombar's The Salt Eaters, that starts with that line, "Do you want to be well?" Right? So that, yeah, the art is always also, in terms of content, exploring ideas of wellness and health. And I really liked what you said, Professor Livingston, about the inside and the outside, or what you know, Henry Louis Gates Jr. talks about the private utterances that Black artists try to make, because art is about self-expression, but then the public statement that is being made with the art. And there's a tension there. But I think as an artist, you're always trying to think about humanity and think about the truth. What is the truth about our human experience? And that in and of itself is an act of healing, right? When you're trying to express the truth of your situation. So I think of art as healing in that respect.
Thank you. One last question from our audience. How can we hold while protecting spaces for this kind of art or expression, while also being gatekeepers in the world and continuing practice of exploiting Black-oriented arts, movements, and cultures, especially with the double-edged sword of social media? It's a great question.
So my short answer to that, Malcolm, is that we have to embrace cultural exchange. Art often starts in a closed community with certain codes that community has, but it's going to travel. But appropriation is an issue. But sometimes when work travels outside of the community where it originates, it takes on depth and textures that actually is, you know, ends up being useful to it. But I hear the very important question that you're raising about exploitation and appropriation. And those are serious issues. And I don't have an answer.
I think Prof. Simms responded. That's the response to that for me, Malcolm. We've lived through different platforms of expression. We find ourselves in different contexts of having to deal with one another in different moments, and some are structured in ways that that prevent us, that do more surveillance and those structures are more surveilled, and those structures seem to prevent us from asking the hard questions. I think when you raise social media as one such platform that makes it hard to do that, I would suggest what I hear in Professor Simms's response is a word that I've heard in both Angela and Serena's presentation, is that we have to practice naming what's in front of us. So naming that appropriation, naming that exploitation, it's still a place, as hard as the format, the platform may challenge that in the way that knowledge is used, in the way that expressions are abbreviated and passed across one another. Naming that appropriation, you can give a name to that and open yourselves. We open ourselves to the risk that comes with that, but the risk is not the first time. The need for that courage is not the first time. So name that appropriation that Professor Simms marked and be willing to engage. We've had to form communities under even more, differently challenging circumstances. Right? Communities of engagement and of education. So thank you, Professor Simms, and thanks, Malcolm, for the additional questions.
We have a wonderful question from Professor Gordon, and it's a long one, so feel free to read along with me in the Q&A so I don't stumble on anything and gets confusing. But what is the responsibility and role of museums and educational institutions to Black and Brown communities for inclusion and exclusions? Museums, art, and art collections have been interesting and sometimes troubling relationships with Black and Brown communities and with communities that lack wealth. Sometimes we are on display for troubling voyeuristic gazes. Other times we have limited or no access because we are framed out by cost and other boundaries. That's from Professor Gordon.
Angela and Serena, I'm going to give you an opportunity to jump in. I've got a quick response, but.
Well, it's interesting because I was just thinking about the Whitney Biennial that year where they had the controversy because of the portrait of Emmett Till, open casket. And it was a painting that was done by a white woman. And there was a protest by the African-American community, by African-American artists, because the Whitney chose to have a white person address a pretty pivotal moment in African-American history, when there were African-American artists out there who had done work similar to hers, that work that was a lot more honest. I think that looked at Emmett Till from the African-American perspective, and she attempted to look at it from the African-American perspective and sort of ignored the fact that she, as a white person, could have entered into that story, entered into that event from the white person's perspective, because her perspective was valid, but she was not very honest in the way that she explored that event that happened. And so I think part of the Whitney's problem was that they did not invite African Americans onto their committee. They were choosing that artwork, and that happens a lot where they decide to sort of, I guess the way to say it would be throw a bone to the African-American community by saying, we're going to address some of your issues. We're going to talk about Black Lives Matter, but we're going to do it not from your perspective, but from a white person's perspective. So I think they have the responsibility to include the community. They want the community to come out and support their museums, but they're not willing to give power to the local communities, power to the African-American community, power to African-American artists who live in that community.
I think that's a great answer. Something that I was thinking about, especially with terms of accessibility or inclusion, was kind of this entire collection in a way. I think for me, being so immersed directly in like looking over the collection and understanding what was being put into the museum for me, and knowing it was accessible via like Google Arts and Media, having a sense of knowing what's there was something that I appreciated. And I think for me, something I didn't really get out of museum experiences as a kid was this idea of inclusion. I think now that I'm sort of a grown adult and starting to see that there's places where you don't ever see anything like the Kinsey collection present, right? And you don't see panels like the one happening in front of us, in these conversations and these sort of openings for further knowledge to be there. And I think that's really cool how this sort of question kind of ties into this entire panel. I think it's everything here has been cultivated, and this is an opportunity to get to share power and bring voice to something, as Angela was sort of touching on. And I honestly, I feel like it's very hard, you know, seeing how easily it is to exclude. But once you create this place of inclusion, seeing what can come from that and the conversations that stem and the knowledge that's shared, I think that's such a powerful thing. And so I just kind of wanted to throw that in there, but thank you.
Prof. Gordon, I was just gonna say that your question feels related to Malcolm's question, because I am thinking about the Kinseys and how they started collecting outside of institutions, right? They were just private collectors who were traveling, interested in their own history, interested in African diasporic history, and began collecting these artifacts and art. And now they are aligned with, or, you know, in partnership with institutions like, you know, whoever has to fund it, banks or, you know, and they're in the Tacoma Art Museum. And I do wonder, so their son is the curator, Khalil is the curator, but Khalil works with curators at the different museums where the exhibition travels. And I wonder how that touch by, you know, people within institutions changes what they have. So yeah, it's just all of those questions about, you know, on one hand, I'm inspired by them because they started outside of institutions, but at some point now they are collaborating with museums. And I wonder how that changes the collection and how it's being received.
I can't answer for all institutions, but I do know that this is the first time their collection has been in an art museum specifically. So one of the things that has changed from previous showings was that we requested and were thankfully given more art context, and slightly less of the historical documents. There's still a good balance to that, in my opinion, but we will see more art at TAM than you would have seen had you seen it somewhere else previously. And I think with that and I want to say too, this question, Professor Gordon, is one that I have thought a lot about through this whole process, and we kind of internally are still talking about as a museum all the time. And one of the last events we're going to do with the Kinseys on November 14th is a community conversation about the Kinsey exhibition's impact on Tacoma and the Tacoma Art Museum. And so I'd love just to invite you all to that event. It looks like it will be a virtual event, and you can sign up on our website and press the issue with us and with the Kinseys again, and keep holding us accountable. I want to thank all of you on the panel for being here, and all of you that joined us. If there's any quick last minute comments or questions, throw them in the chat. We'll try to get to them in the next couple minutes, but thank you so much from TAM, and I'll let all of you say goodbye as well.
Thank you so very much, everybody. On behalf of all of our colleagues and our students who work and organize are in our classrooms in the work of race and pedagogy and African American studies at Puget Sound. And thank you again for the work and the memory of the work we've done at Amelia with the Tacoma Art Museum and the work we still have to do. appreciation for the questions and for presence. And this is the first of 3 this month. And thank you so much, Angela and Serena and Prof. Renee Simms for your leadership and your curation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Livingston.
I just invite everyone to go see the show at TAM. We're open late every Thursday from 5 to 8 p.m. It's free, but we also extended our hours on Fridays and Saturdays till 8 p.m. So please come see it and experience it, spend some time. And yeah, come join us next week for another discussion with race and pedagogy. And you can sign up online as well. And just thank you, everyone.